The tractor is often romanticized. There's a lot you could say, a lot of grandiose things you could say about the tractor, but there's a lot of truth to the impact that the tractor has made, really taking farmers in places like America from lifestyle, subsistence, full-time farmers to farm business people. And it really laid the groundwork for the modern agricultural system we have today. It's, in fact, impossible to picture the modern food system we have today without the invention of the tractor. And it happened really not that long ago. Just over 100 years ago was the invention of the tractor, and at least the gas-powered tractor, and the commercialization of it even less than that in terms of widespread adoption. Today, we're going to be talking about this book, Tractor Wars by Neil Dahlstrom. Neil is the manager of archives and history at John Deere, and tackling this book because it is a pretty factual and dense history book is my good friend and repeat host on the podcast, Rhishi Pethe. Rhishi, thank you for doing this.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Thanks for having me again. I'm excited to talk about this book and discuss some interesting history and see if there are some lessons we can learn from that history in terms of what's happening right now.
Yeah, and those lessons are really what I want to focus on. I think when you and I set out reading this book and decided we wanted to talk about it on the podcast, we thought we would try to summarize it. But there's just so much information in here that it's impossible for us to distill this down into anything resembling a reasonable length episode. But we can distill down the basics and some insights. So I highly recommend, if you're all interested in the history of the tractor, especially interested in the history of John Deere, International Harvester, and then the Ford tractor, you need to read this book because, well, the subtitle is John Deere, Henry Ford, International Harvester, and the Birth of Modern Agriculture. And that is exactly what you'll get from this book. I did think I'd kick us off, though, with just reading a little bit from the epilogue, because I think it does a good job of summarizing what we're talking about here. And Dahlstrom writes this: Fortune magazine called the 1920s the decade of the Fordson, which is Ford's tractor. Not everyone agreed, but the fact that the Fordson accelerated adoption of the farm tractor and forever altered the competitive landscape is undeniable. Ford was right about the insatiable appetite for automobiles and, in time, for farm tractors. There were now 17 million passenger cars and nearly 2.5 million trucks traveling on more than 521,000 miles of surfaced roads, but he had miscalculated the connection between farmers and their land and their constantly evolving needs. Most importantly, farmers wanted to fortify that relationship, not end it. Only 33 American farm tractor manufacturers remained in 1929 as mergers, consolidations, and bankruptcies continued to narrow the field. In its overview of the tractor industry in early 1928, the Tractor Field Book surmised that large numbers of inefficient machines were discarded during the 5-year period from 1920 to 1924, as many were built by companies whose efforts were largely experimental. So it's that process of like explosion and consolidation that we're going to be talking about here today from Neil's book. This all starts, I guess, if we're going to start the story with the first successful American tractor, which was built by Charles W. Hart and Charles H. Parr in 1903, with then significant developments happening in the 5 years that followed that. But as that part of the book that I just read kind of illustrated, the industry went from selling about 10,000 tractors a year in the 1910s to 150,000 a year by the late 1910s. And all of these new players came out of the woodwork. I mean, well over 100 different manufacturers of tractors happened as this explosion happened, which really followed the adoption of the gas-powered automobile. So things were changing. Another quote from Neil's book says, "A generation ago, farming was an occupation. Today, it's a profession, a science." So I thought that was a good illustration of kind of what was happening here in the early 1900s. And I thought it would be a great topic for an episode of Future of Ag. So Rhishi, well, let's bring you in here. Why did you think this story might be relevant for listeners of the podcast?
Yeah, this is a very interesting book and an interesting question. I mean, one, I'm a big history nerd, so I like to read about history, about different topics. I know, Tim, you are as well. And, working in this space in agriculture and food and technology, this was just a fascinating read about how, all these different companies innovated on this brand new innovation, which could completely change, as you said earlier, how agriculture actually was practiced. And the reason I wanted to discuss this book with you and the topics around it, Tim, was because I see a lot of similarities between what's happening now versus what was happening, let's say, more than 100 years ago. I think there were similar challenges. There was a lot of urbanization in the early 20th century, which led to labor shortages in agriculture. People are moving to the cities, and that required a need for mechanical solutions like tractors. At the same time, there were global events happening. There was the First World War, there was the Spanish flu pandemic, there was the economic crisis of the 1920s. I mean, if I didn't use the word First World War or Spanish flu, somebody would think we're talking about 2025 and what's happening right now. And there's also a lot of discussion around automation and autonomy in agriculture as of today, and which is very similar to the type of discussions that were happening in the early 20th century. So I think just the juxtaposition of the situation, the technology, the issues that people were discussing 100 years ago versus now is just so much similar. I felt there was something that we could learn from this story and try to see if we can apply some of those lessons to today.
Yeah, and I 100% agree that there are some direct parallels. You talk about pandemic and war, and it's like, oh, okay, the recent ones, but also I think whenever I study history, I should know this by now because I think this is maybe, I don't know, the 8th or 9th history episode I've done. Whenever I do one of these episodes, I think, oh, it's crazy to me that the innovation that was happening, the shift that was happening was not obvious at the time. Like everybody was not on board with the tractor. And of course, we're going to talk about the Horse Association, which was obviously the biggest enemy of the tractor movement. But it was really the masses that were just not thinking that this was going to be a industry shifting thing. And that seems to happen every time we do a history episode. It's like, boy, this sure seems obvious. And I think whenever you study history, the first level of understanding history is like you understand the events and you kind of make the connections in your brain like, oh, yeah, there was a gas-powered automobile. So obviously there was a gas-powered tractor and that got rid of all the horses that we needed to use on farm work. But no, it's not obvious at all, and actually took years and years and years. The period of time we're going to study today is really kind of from 1902, when the tractor was kind of first invented, and at least the American tractor was, to 1929 is basically the period that Dahlstrom focuses on in this book. There was already established players, right? They weren't established tractor companies, but they were established farm equipment manufacturers, the biggest of which was probably International Harvester Company, which was formed by merger in 1902 between McCormick Harvesting Company, Deering Harvester Company, and a few other small firms. If you haven't listened to our Cyrus McCormick history episode, you definitely want to go do that if you want some more context here. But when that happened, this consolidated 85% of the harvesting equipment market into one company. So basically, International Harvester Company was this behemoth after this merger. At that time, it was the fourth largest corporation in the U.S. with $10 million in sales about in 1907. So they had harvesters, they had other pieces of equipment like manure spreaders, pump jacks, etc. And they were probably the most obvious company to benefit from tractors, right? They started some small projects developing a tractor when they were seeing the rise of gas-powered automobiles during this time. And we're very much well positioned to benefit from the rise of the tractor. Dahlstrom writes, by the end of 1906, that amounted to 15 tractors, earning International Harvester a leading position in the field, though well behind the Parr Company of Charles City, Iowa, whose 30 horsepower number one debuted in 1902. So in 1906, the company built nearly 150 tractors. This is International Harvester Company, more than half of those available nationwide at the time. So, less than 300 available tractors at the time. International Harvester had 150 of them. But, this wasn't a instant success, as nothing really is, even though they were the dominant player in the farm equipment market at the time. There were others, right? Deere, for example, had the plows, and they were kind of dominant in the plow market. And Deere and International Harvester sort of decided, whether consciously or unconsciously, to stay in their lane. I think the book would support that there were direct conversations between the two companies, that they were going to stay in their lanes at the time. But this tractor opportunity was certainly looming. One character that I know you and I have talked about that we could do a whole episode on is this guy named Alexander Legge. I think it's how you pronounce it. It's Legge. At this time, he was the president of International Harvester Company. He's a former cowboy. He challenged Henry Ford directly and really kind of was this just fiery presence with International Harvester with a fascinating backstory. And he also goes on to some big kind of international diplomacy type roles later. And I think we could do a whole episode on him. But anyway, that sort of sets the scene with kind of the market dominant player in the farm equipment space at the time, International Harvester. But they didn't end up kind of leading through this era, did they, Rhishi?
No, they didn't. And I think you mentioned Deere. I mean, right now, sitting here in 2025, John Deere is the big 800-pound gorilla when it comes to ag equipment and tractors and combines and all that, right? But as you said earlier, they were a bit hesitant to get into the tractor business, even though they had been in the farming business for quite some time. So love to get your perspective, Tim, on what was Deere's position and what were they thinking in the early 20th century when it came to tractors?
Yeah, it's interesting because, Neil Dahlstrom, who wrote this book, is an employee of Deere. And so I guess we should mention that. I didn't think in terms of editorial, I didn't think there was a lot of bias in the book because it's very fact-based, but he obviously had a lot more information on Deere than any of the other players. He's got internal archives of information at his fingertips. So there is a lot in the book about Deere for that reason. And what's cool about that is he was able to document the internal dynamics at that time. And it was not consensus that they should pursue any sort of investment in tractors for a combination of reasons. One reason being that the market wasn't exactly clear, the tech wasn't exactly there, and then also the competition that was entering the space. Do you really want to go up against a International Harvester or, as we're about to talk about, Ford? And so it wasn't consensus within Deere that they should. It took years of kind of back and forth, and relative to the other two major players in the book, International Harvester and Ford, they were on the later side of having a commercially viable tractor product. So I think this tractor opportunity pushed Deere from viewing themselves only as a plow company to viewing themselves, in fact, the book says, as a full line farm equipment company. There's a quote here that says, "The time had at last come to rebuild John Deere based on the prevalent organizational models of Standard Oil, U.S. Steel, and proven attainable by the International Harvester Company. John Deere would make and sell everything needed on the farm. The industry called it full line. The plan was straightforward. First, consolidate existing sales branches and co-partnerships, then acquire complementary product lines, and last, add additional lines. The work was now to be formally led by a group internally known as the Committee of Five." So they kind of made that decision. I think that was around 1910. It still took a while to kind of invest in and get the tractor going on the Deere side, but certainly an interesting dynamic inside of Deere at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you touched on some really interesting topics here. You talked about a full line of business, right? And, one thing which I took away from that is like, if I'm a farmer, anything I need on the farm, I can go to John Deere, assuming they get to the full line at some point in time, and they will satisfy all my needs. I think that was a big strategic decision. I think this idea of complements, people talk about the theory of complements and how that can increase your wallet of share with a particular customer. So, we talk about these as new concepts, but, in the earlier 20th century, people are already thinking about how to pull in a customer and keep them with you by just giving them more and more products that they need to run their farm. I mean, one interesting thing which I read with Deere was they were worried that using a tractor was going to be a practice change or a behavior change for the farmer. Like, what did you think about that particular aspect? Because I see that even today, going with something which is not going to drive a big practice change for the farmer, that will create better adoption.
Yeah, I think it's complicated, right? So my initial knee jerk is like, yeah, they knew their customer. They knew their customer really well. They knew it was not going to be easy. They had a better sense of go to market when it comes to selling farm tools than like Ford. Even though Ford sold a lot of automobiles to farmers, he wasn't selling them farm equipment. So that's my knee jerk reaction, but it goes a level deeper than that, which is also a little bit of innovator's dilemma here too, right? Of saying, yeah, our customer does this, and assuming that that customer will never adapt and change has its own sort of negative consequences and big risks. So I guess it's both in this case. And we sort of, I think this is where I'm grateful for the innovators that come into the space, even if they are naive to the way things have always been done, because it sort of took both in this story. It took Ford to come in and just say, the world is changing. I've proved it with automobiles. I'm going to prove it with tractors, right? But also Deere and to an extent, International Harvester to say like, well, hold on, like maybe things are going to change, but we're not going to bet the farm on this quite yet, and kind of figure out the quality that has to be backed up in order to ultimately get adoption from farmers.
Yeah, and I think you brought up Ford. I mean, I find him, as you mentioned, along with Alexander Legge, as two of the most interesting characters in this book. And around that time, I mean, obviously everybody knows Henry Ford as the Model T, Ford Motor Company, but he was the one who really helped with the adoption of tractors based on his philosophy. And I'm going to read a quote from Henry Ford here, where he said, "Nothing could be more inexcusable than the average farmer, his wife, and their children drudging from early morning until late at night. That is how farming was practiced. Everybody was working with their hands and animals and horses." And he was like, "That is crazy. We need to change that." And he's a very interesting character. I almost think of him as the Elon Musk of the early 20th century. I think he would have been great on Twitter.
Yeah, he would have.
And, some of the data that the book presents, like, for example, from 1910 to 1920 alone, the population of the US grew by 15%. There were 25 million horses on 6.5 million farms, and half of the country's population still lived on the farm. But because of migration to the city, there were a lot of challenges in getting labor to work on the farm. And Henry Ford came in with all his success that he had with Model T and the automobile. He was like, I'm going to apply the same principle here. I'm going to design and manufacture and distribute a tractor, which he called it as Fordson, which is going to be very affordable and is going to be available in the one size and one shape. Similarly, he applied the same principle as Model T. And I'm going to sell this, and I'm going to sell it at a price where it will lead to massive adoption. And he was very ambitious. You talked about numbers of like, oh, there were 300 tractors in year one. He was talking about selling 1 million tractors a year, early on. So I think he really was a catalyst in the adoption of tractors. And he also created so much competitive pressure for International Harvester and Deere and all the other folks involved. I think that led to a lot of rapid innovation on the technology side, as well as distribution and branding and all that, right? So that was very interesting. So we talked a little bit about Ford and what he was doing in Deere. What was International Harvester up to during that time?
Yeah, so I mean, they were kind of the dominant leader of that time, and actually an early leader when it came to tractors. You can look back at Cyrus McCormick on our previous episode. He owned marketing in the 1800s and made the harvester happen. At this time, I would say it was Ford who really owned the marketing of the day. And so you had International Harvester that was kind of building some sound quality machines, but they weren't going out there and grabbing the attention the way that Henry Ford was. Another thing, just to add on what you said about Ford, I think in my limited understanding of Henry Ford and of history before, I thought, okay, this guy, obviously, he was the car guy. He was the automobile guy, and he sort of dabbled in tractors and, viewed it as maybe like a cute side project of his. But in reality, like he was very committed to this. It was deeply ingrained in him. That quote you read, I love, because it comes from his firsthand experiences of watching his own family struggle on the farm like that. This was a big part of his motivation and a big part of where he dedicated his life. During the book, I want to say it was 1918 or 19, he left. He resigned from Ford Motor Company. This was a big part of the next chapter of his career in life. So I thought that was something interesting to tack on there. But, talking about the marketing of the day. So the marketing of the day during this time, this rise of the tractor coincided with peak farm show, I would say. Just to give you an idea, peak farm show happened over 100 years ago. In 1908, the Winnipeg Industrial Exposition drew 200,000 attendees. International Harvester was there with their Model A, which is their tractor, which obviously was a huge boom for them. And then 2 years later, Henry Ford would be there and kind of inspire a lot of his tractor work to build a sense of urgency that I believe, he had to fight people within Ford to let him even do at that time to pursue the tractor. So these farm shows were starting to happen. Winnipeg didn't last very long. I think maybe 1913 was the last year of Winnipeg. But then there was this national power farming demonstration that started as one location and ended up being a kind of a tour around several locations. But the first year for that was 1913 in Fremont, Nebraska. And then 3 years later, Henry Ford would show up there. So 6 years after he attended Winnipeg, he would show up there with his first tractor and kind of get all the attention and steal all the headlines. And so I just kind of, the takeaway there is like hacking the marketing of the day. That's where the attention was, right? And nobody could do it better than Henry Ford as far as like drawing attention. I did take down a quote here from the book that says, one thing tractor manufacturers of the day could agree on was that head-on competition with Ford was complete suicide. And it was because of his credibility from the automobile side, especially with farmers. He sold a lot of farmers, a lot of cars, but also his just ability to create attention, to build attention.
Yeah. And I think the farm show was almost like a traveling circus, right? They would start from some place. I think they started somewhere in the south and they kept going north or the other way around. And so, they couldn't expect people from all over the US and Canada to come to one place. So they would basically take all these tractors and all this equipment and travel all along. And there's a lot of interesting stories in there about how people would spy on each other's equipment and how doing demonstrations was a key part of marketing, right? Farmers would come there and actually see side by side demonstrations of all this equipment, which is no different than, if you go to a FIRA or a farm progress show, you see that today, which was very interesting. I think the other angle which I really liked was this whole battle of who has better technology and why, and which was also very interesting, which we see even today. There was a lot of talk about we have a 2-cylinder engine and we have a 4-cylinder engine. And initially Deere stuck with the 2-cylinder engine because it was simple and reliable and cheaper, cost effective. I think fewer cylinders also meant fewer moving parts, which reduced a number of breakdowns and downtime and repair costs. Whereas Ford and International Harvester, they went with the 4-cylinder approach because it gave you more power and speed. And they were putting forward, from a marketing standpoint, they're putting forward more of a technology-led approach that, hey, we are cutting edge and we are more powerful, etc. So I think that was also a very interesting piece. Ultimately, Deere also went to a 4-cylinder model because that just worked better because the power requirements were higher and higher as we saw more and more consolidation happening in the farm, more and more people leaving for cities. But this brings up an interesting question on, Deere's approach was more around like simplicity, ease of use. And yes, Ford and International Harvester had some of that, but they were also around sort of pricing and technology. And so I see these differences in branding. Like, what did you think about you talked about the marketing, but what about how they were positioning themselves and branding their own companies and their products?
Yeah, I wish there was one of those market maps, that
the mixing bowl.
Yeah, the mixing bowl was around then to make one of those market maps. It would have been interesting to see all the brands of the different tractor companies because there's something like 200 plus tractor companies at this time. It would have been interesting to see that. But yeah, in that landscape, brand becomes extremely important. Obviously, no farmer is going to try 200 different types of tractors. They're going to say like, okay, what has some sort of brand trust that, I'm going to spend my precious time and attention looking at and trying. And so, yeah, that brand becomes so important. And what's so fascinating to me is how that has carried through 100 plus years later. Like when it comes to branding and agriculture, there is nothing like more firmly rooted than in farm equipment. Like you drive green, do you drive red, do you drive blue? What is it? And so you can really start to see the beginnings at that time of the branding becoming so really important. And you get a lot of like, I guess, lesser known brands, like Deere's entrance into tractors really came when they bought Waterloo, which is like a gas powered tractor company at the time. So they kind of made their big entrance into the market. And they had this tractor called the Waterloo Boy. Now, the Waterloo Boy, doesn't exist anymore, to my knowledge. But I think as Deere became more and more aware of this branding, they probably became more and more diligent with how they branded things. Of course, after that big consolidation happens. But after brand, the biggest thing was price. And a lot of this book is about the fact that Ford was going lower and lower and lower and lower on price as much as they could. And almost everyone else couldn't possibly create a profitable business by coming anywhere close to those prices. But I'd love to hear your perspective on how that sort of separated things.
Yeah, I think the pricing aspect and the pricing wars, if you can call them, one of the most fascinating aspects of that time. And, Ford had, given his experience with the Model T, his approach was very interesting. He would first think of a price and then tell his team, like, hey, this is the price we're going to sell our tractor at. Now go make it happen.
That is very Elon Musk-like, back to your point earlier.
And because of his big brand, this is going to the brand, people trusted him and the Ford brand that they know how to make these machines. And so we trust this tractor that he's making, and it's at an attractive price. He was always trying to, because his goal, remember, his goal was to make sure that nobody ever works on a farm, right? Like nobody spends their time doing that. He wanted to automate everything. And so he always was trying to go for the low price. And given that this was such a competitive space, people had so many different options. And yes, there were differences in technology and some of the what the tractor could do, but price was a big thing. And so Deere and International Harvest and all of these other companies had to constantly make sure they were staying within range of a Fordson, that was a tractor they called. And there's one interesting incident in the book, which I'll quickly read. It's a couple of lines here. And this is the scene is McCormick and Leggy. They were together and they're doing some inspection at some show. And during that inspection, they got an urgent phone call from Chicago. So Leggy grabbed the receiver and put it to his ear. McCormick watched and listened. It was all he could do. While there was much talk on the other end, then an explosion from Alex. And basically what had happened was Henry Ford was on the other side of the phone, and he said that I'm going to drop the price of my tractor from $625 to $395. And that $625 itself was a lower price. Earlier it was $950. So you can see he dropped the price by almost 60% within a short amount of time. Went from $950 to $625 to $395. And then Leggy screams into the receiver, like, what do you think we're going to do? We obviously have to meet him. We have to stay in the tractor business, right? So this was existential for all these companies. And, Ford was a huge force, not just purely by personality and the products that he brought to the table, but he was a big force in terms of driving change and in terms of making this product affordable to farmers and driving his teams and everybody in the industry to come up with products that farmers could buy at a price that was very attractive. That was super interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that, things like that drive a ton of innovation. So Ford had the money, right? If he was a much smaller unknown, it would have been really, really difficult for him to do that. But he certainly was pushing the boundaries of what the other companies in the space, the rules the other companies in the space had to play by. And it did seem like the pricing wars had their era. And then as the market sort of matured, it became much more about quality and distribution, ability to service, a lot of things we talk about right now that make it very, very difficult for new entrants into the space to succeed. But as the market sort of matured, those things started to grow and separate. I'll make one more point here because I know we're going to move on, but that era of the like peak farm show, as I called it, all that's not probably a technically accurate term, but I kind of like it. It kind of came and went. The wave crashed quickly. In 1919, Kansas City hosted a show that was just a horrible turnout. International Harvester's marketing manager is quoted as saying, the industry was well represented, but the farmers were missing. And I couldn't help but think of other ag tech shows that happen right now where it's like the industry's there and excited and optimistic and things are going to start happening and there's like very few farmers in sight. I'm not saying that there's a cause and effect relationship there where that means that, everything's going to be consolidated and, in the hands of three companies in the end, but it's sort of an interesting parallel. There was still plenty of competition. This is from Dahlstrom as well. There was still plenty of competition, less fraud, but a growing debate about the value of a tractor versus a team of horses. It was clear to most, though, that despite the latest wave of new models, the field of viable manufacturers was narrowing. And that gets us into some consolidation. So we go from this like boom phase to like this more consolidation phase. And Rhishi, I don't know if you want to talk about that one a little bit, the consolidation.
Yeah, I think before we jump to consolidation, I mean, something you mentioned, the field was thinning. And some of the reasons were that because this was a new product, even though it was very exciting and very useful, you still had to get the product in front of the farmer and have access to a distribution channel and, be there because these were early products, they broke down, they needed parts, they needed to be fixed. And so customer support and after sales support was super important. And so throughout the book and other stuff that we've been talking about, all of these big companies are very worried about their dealers and how do they educate their dealers and how do they support them, which is again no different than today, right? We talk about how having a strong after sales support is super important. And for example, Deere was always worried about not having enough parts. Something breaks down, it'll replace it. And they always insisted on dealer training before releasing a tractor, right? So they were thinking about, again, the overall ownership experience of the farmer. It was not just like, oh, I sold you a tractor and now I'm going to go away, you'll never hear from me. They wanted to make sure the farmers were successful with their product so that they'll come back and buy a product later. So I think that was very interesting. And the book goes into some of the distribution network of these companies. For example, Deere had 29 branches and sub branches in the US and Canada, whereas International Harvester, which you have, as you said, were much bigger. They had 93 branches, which is almost 3 times the size of a distribution network compared to Deere. So, as you said, I think there was consolidation, and there are many reasons for that. Right? This was a difficult business, even though hundreds and thousands of units were sold. You had to convince a farmer to buy this. You need to have deep pockets because the R&D cycles were very long. It would take a few years to bring a new model to market, and then have the network on the ground to support these companies. So it was inevitable, I think, that few companies who had deep pockets, who had sort of really fast sales to bring in revenue to support those cycles, would survive. And maybe Tim, you did mention the Great Depression was sort of looming on the horizon. There were a lot of economic issues. People had just come out of the First World War, and the book does talk about a lot of the impact of geopolitical issues on the tractor wars and how people are making decisions. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, it definitely starts with World War One, right? I mean, 1917. Basically, Ford says England gets the tractors first. They need it. Germany's trying to starve them. And so it accelerates the need for tractors in general because people are going to fight the war. Millions of people died, but also they were just occupied fighting. And so we needed something to still produce our, food, fiber, natural resources while this war was going on. And obviously, tractor was the technology of the day that could displace some on-farm labor, especially when you consider the alternative being horses, right? So it starts there. Every history episode that we've done has some sort of geopolitical aspect to it that accelerates the innovation, accelerates the adoption, accelerates the advancements that are happening. And World War I was certainly an accelerator at this time. But then, our country and the world really fell on some really tough times. Quote from the book here says, there were signs, but when faced with unparalleled demand and record profits, tractor manufacturers preferred to embrace their newfound prosperity. Post-war America was a land of mobility and freedom for sure, but a growing disparity was further evident as a smaller percentage of the population controlled more of the nation's wealth. A world war, a global pandemic that would claim the lives of nearly 700,000 Americans, and a growing reliance on credit for financing new and larger purchases hinted at even darker days ahead. And those days were ahead. The farm equipment, farm machinery industry has always been very cyclical. I don't want to go so far as to call it boom and bust, but there certainly are elements of that, right? When farmers are doing well, they're going to, make these purchases. When the farm economy is not, or when the economy in general is not, it can be very, very tough. And in this budding industry where there were so many entrants going into, the early 1920s, that consolidation happened very, very fast because many could not weather the storm. And the adoption didn't happen the way that I'm sure a lot of them expected it to. It's like, you're using horses right now. I've got a tractor. I'll help you afford it. I'll put it on credit. But it's not quite that easy. As we've seen time and time again, it feels like we still need to learn these lessons because a lot of the headlines, whenever ag tech is up and booming, are like, here we go. Vertical farming is going to, plant lettuce in Salinas Valley this year because, vertical farming is going to take it all. It just doesn't happen that way, no matter what the technology is.
I think, as you're talking about the geopolitical issues, it almost feels like history repeats itself, or if not repeat, definitely rhymes. So, we are here in 2025. What are your thoughts on what's happening right now, and what are some of the echoes of in the early 20th century that we are hearing right now?
Yeah, I think I'll take the most obvious one, Rishi, which is probably, autonomy right now. We went from replacing, the horse with the tractor to now potentially replacing some manpower with autonomy and automation. I thought it was funny in the book. They mentioned the concept of the horseless farm, like almost like a demonstration where it's like, we're going to have a farm completely farmed without horses. And it's like, whoa. And, we've got some of those rumblings right now. It's like, oh, fully autonomous farm and people trying to do that sort of thing. So, that's sort of the most obvious parallel for me. I think you're exactly right that history definitely rhymes. And the lesson time and time again is that in the moment, it's never obvious. You're going to have a group of people that are fully on board. They're fully bought in. They think it's inevitable, and it's probably going to happen slower than they think. And then you're going to have the majority of people that are skeptical that anything's going to change, and it's going to happen whether they like it or not. And both of these things are true. They might seem like opposing things, like one side wins and one side doesn't, but that's not true, right? One of the quotes from the book, and I'll read it here. It says, Lynn Ellis, author and analyst from the United States Department of Agriculture, doubted the horse would be cast aside anytime soon. Exploring the problem of the small farm tractor in Scientific American in 1913, manufacturers had yet to overcome the fact that the horse is by far the most flexible motor for small jobs. As yet, the small farmer cannot supplant all his horses with a small tractor, Ellis wrote, which meant that at best, the tractor offered supplemental power to replace a few horses on the farm. The horse was not going anywhere. And of course, it wasn't true, but it probably was true for a while. And that's sort of my point here. We're going through a downtime right now in ag tech in many ways. We have companies that are closing their doors. We have a huge pullback in investment. There's a lot to be negative about in ag tech right now. Does it mean that we're not moving forward? I don't think so. I think it's obvious when you see this boom and bust of this tractor that we are moving forward. It's just not going to be at the pace that the most eternal ag tech optimists, like I tend to be, and I know a lot of others, it's not going to happen at the pace we think it's going to happen. What about you? I mean, in terms of history repeating or rhyming?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, a lot of similarities, right? You talked about automation. You talked about whenever there's an opportunity, a whole bunch of entrepreneurs will rush into the space to take advantage of that. And that has been true forever. And we see that today, like, you're talking about the mixing bowl landscape map, the one from 2024 has 350 or 400 crop robotics companies on it because everybody's thinking like, hey, what can we do to reduce the dependence on labor, which is a big challenge on the farm today, not just here, everywhere in the world. And so how do you position yourself, your company, and all these entrepreneurs coming in? And to your point, a human being on the farm is probably the most flexible resource that we have, similar to the horse. I'm not comparing a horse to a human, but I think it's inevitable that with newer and newer technology like automation, I think what humans do on the farm will change. They probably, fewer and fewer people will be working on the farm. Maybe they're sitting remotely monitoring their equipment or doing data analysis or whatever it is, right? But again, to your point, that is not going to happen immediately. I think the other key takeaway for me was that, just like the policy and the geopolitics and the trade disputes of that time were a big factor in making decisions. And you could not sort of figure out which way things are going to move at that moment in time. Now looking back, hindsight is always 2020, like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But to your earlier point, it was not evident. And, sitting here today, we have similar issues on trade policy, ag policy, labor, geopolitics. And sitting here, we cannot, really figure out exactly how things are going to end, but we have to make decisions based on the best available information that we have. I think the other key takeaway for me was that when you have people who believe in something and they really go for it, like they can really drive change, whether that happens at the pace that they want or not. It probably never happens at the pace that they want because they're very impatient, like Henry Ford or Legge or all of these different interesting characters. So I think the agency of people who work in the industry matters, and which direction they want to push the industry matters, because it might not seem we are moving in that direction in the moment, but in the long term, it has an impact.
Yeah, totally. And one more thing I'll just mention, this is just for fun, but there was this organization called the Horse Association of America. I alluded to it earlier. And throughout the book, there's just scattered little comments from them. They're like PR campaigns against the tractor. And my note there is just like, don't fight innovation. Like, I mean, if you really are the best solution, you don't need to go trash on other people's solutions, right? And also, don't fight innovation. Find a way to stay ahead of it or stay on top of it if you can. But I thought those comments from this horse association were funny. And
Yeah, I mean, it's almost a tell, right? That the reason that you are fighting, that means one, you're scared, and on the inside, you know that the time of the horse on the farm, I mean, there's still horses on the farm, but they're a much smaller proportion in terms of what it was in the early 20th century. So I think on the inside, they knew this was happening. I think that's why they were sort of making all these statements, because I think it was coming almost from a place of fear and anxiety. That's my interpretation. I don't know what they were thinking, but that's what it feels like.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, fear and anxiety are going to happen. It's certainly prevalent right now for a lot of very good reasons, but this too shall pass. So when it comes down to it, as we wrap up here, Rhishi, takeaways from the book that you'd want the FOA audience to keep in mind. I'll go first here and just say, innovation happens at its own pace. There are catalysts, especially outside of our control, like geopolitical factors that can certainly accelerate the pace of innovation. It can feel like you're getting nowhere when you're actually getting somewhere. It can feel like you're getting somewhere when you're actually, a decade away. It happens at its own pace. And I think that's just abundantly clear from this book and also from other examples that we've had. But then also, it's going to ebb and flow. Just because someone else had the idea and executed it first, or just because someone else is getting all the attention at the farm show, if you're playing an infinite game, play it accordingly. Play it with that strategy and with that in mind, because over time, quality and the ability to own that relationship with your customer is going to win. And that's me maybe talking my own book a little bit, but it's certainly takeaways for me from this book. Rhishi, what would you add?
Yeah, I think I would double down on what you said. I think quality matters. I think knowing the customer and what their needs are is really important. I think that is one key difference between Ford and other people. Like Ford, like, this is the tractor, and he definitely drew down the price, but you're like, this is the tractor I'm making, and you're going to buy it. Whereas, Deere and others, they were like, okay, what are the customer needs? All the farms are different. All of them are slightly different needs. So how do we address those needs? I think that customer centricity was very interesting, and how that showed up in the future. I think that was very important. We already talked about distribution. We talked about having deep pockets, especially if you're going to go into a brand new area of innovation, which requires a lot of upfront investment. And I think robotics falls into that category. And that's why we see so many companies right now. But if I had to take a guess, maybe 5 years from now, I think that chart is going to look much smaller and sparser. But I think that should not, sort of, to your point, keep us down. Like, I think, all of these characters in this book, they kept their head down, kept working, kept chipping away at the problem. And I think that's another key thing to learn from, all these characters from 100 years ago.
Absolutely. Well, if you've listened to this and you're like, boy, I'd sure like more details. I'd sure like to know what exactly were the models, what years did they come out, what exactly happened in these meetings, internal meetings at Deere. You need to pick up this book. It definitely reads more like a history book than the other ones that we've covered on this show. More facts. It's very, very well researched than, necessarily like one continuous story, but it's worth reading, especially if you're at all interested in this type of topic. Pick up Tractor Wars by Neil Dahlstrom. We'll leave a link in the show notes. I don't do like an affiliate program or anything like that. I get nothing from it, but go check it out and pick it up if you'd like. And thank you so much, Rhishi, for being willing to do this, tackle this book. And if you like this history of agriculture stuff, make sure you let us know. You can find Rhishi and I both on either LinkedIn or X, or send us an email. Specifically, you need to get on Rishi's email list for his newsletter, Software is Feeding the World. Link for that will also be in the show notes for today's episode. But with that, thank you so much for staying all the way to the end. Thanks for your time and your attention. I don't take it lightly. I'll be back next week with another story of ag innovation.